Hi everybody, and welcome to another video. Today I'd like to show my process for making a mock-up of a transcription for strings using sample libraries. There's a bunch of ways to do this, and I'm not claiming my method is better than any other, but I thought maybe this would be helpful to some of you. I'll be using a combination of Berlin strings and Spitfire Appassionata strings layered together. I transcribed a section of Joe Hisaishi's symphonic poem Nausicaa, which is his orchestral work based on music from the film. Hisaishi has several symphonic works based on music from his films, and you can actually find scores online for a few of them. But as far as I know, you can't purchase this particular symphonic poem. So in preparation for my series on his music, I transcribed a good chunk of this piece. I'm not going to show my process for transcribing, but I did this in Dorico, and I know that it's not 100% accurate because it's really difficult to hear everything in an orchestral recording, but I think I got pretty close here. This particular passage features the strings pretty heavily, so I have separate staves for each string instrument, then just a few staves for the other instruments that I heard. I try to have as few staves as possible, but it's best to have individual parts or lines within the texture on its own staff. Otherwise, separating parts from one MIDI track in Cubase or whatever DAW you're using can be a pain. But these flute parts, for instance, are perfectly fine on one track. Before exporting the MIDI, I like to make sure to add bowings for the strings. I tried as best as I could to hear the correct bowings from the recording, but it's really difficult. Honestly, it's not the most important thing to transcribe bowings accurately, but writing in these bow markings, these slurs here, will be useful when it comes time to mock it up. So I do that at this point. I don't really care about notating dynamics at this point because it'll sound more natural if I wait to do that in the DAW. Okay, so I'll export this as a MIDI file. In Dorico, I make sure to remove any expression maps that may contain key switches. Otherwise, those key switches will show up as notes in Cubase. Then I export as a MIDI file. I think MIDI works better than Music XML for importing into a DAW, at least for my needs. So now I'll open up my orchestral template in Cubase. From there, I can import the MIDI either into this project or into a new one. I'll choose this one, although there is some benefit to importing into a new project because Cubase will import the tempo and meter changes into a new one, and those won't show up in my pre-existing template here. Often I'll import into a new project and then copy those meter and tempo changes along with the MIDI tracks into my template project. Either method works fine. Cubase automatically creates a VST rack instrument of Halion, which I don't need, so I'll remove that. I'm showing the Dorico score here on the right. Normally I'd have that on my other monitor, but I'm squeezing everything in on one screen for this video. I'll start with the cello part, since they start with the melody. I can just cut and paste this MIDI track right into my Berlin cello legatos track. I really like having all the notes and rhythms already in place. Sometimes I prefer to play lines in using my keyboard because I feel that that gives a more natural performance, but it takes a lot more time. And lately I'm all about efficiency. So now I just start adjusting note entrance points, note lengths, and which notes overlap, which is the bowing or the slurs. This is why I make sure to have those slurs notated beforehand. I've already made those bowing decisions in a manner that's more intuitive to me. I should mention that I'm using negative track delays here. For those of you who don't know what that means, basically all sample libraries have some built-in delay time, usually 50 or so milliseconds before the actual attack of the sound is heard. And with legato transitions, that time can be even longer, sometimes over 100 milliseconds. In these Berlin string legato patches, the transition times between slurred notes is fairly consistent, so I can set the negative delay time on each track, which means the notes and transitions will start earlier than what's on the page. That makes legato transitions really easy to work with, but the starts of new notes that aren't slurred will usually be early now, so I often have to move the note forward. But I've found that moving the starts of these notes forward a bit is way easier than moving legato transition notes back, for whatever reason. For those of you who are confused by all of this, the composer David Cadell has an entire video on this, and it's really helpful. But even with all the time I save on those things, it's still somewhat a slow and tedious process if you want really good results. By the way, I have the metronome on while I'm doing this. I just don't have that sound routed through the video because I thought that click sound would be a little annoying. Basically, I go through the entire cello part, at least this first big chunk of music, and get the timings and bowings right. Then I jump back to the start and work on dynamics. I have both CC1 and CC11 lanes here to work with. CC1, or modulation, triggers the dynamic layer, and CC11, or expression, controls instrument volume. I rely primarily on CC1, but I find adding in the expression automation can help with crescendos or diminuendos, and especially with fading out at the end of phrases. I'll use the parametric curve tool in Cubase. That's just what I'm most comfortable with. This process is also a bit time consuming and it can be a bit tricky. Even though this entire passage is basically marked soft, I still need some dynamic shape to it. I just won't be using the top dynamic layers in the samples. A good rule of thumb for drawing in these dynamic curves is to first decide if the musical line is in the foreground, which this cello part is. So I'll make sure to bring this part out and to have the other parts back off a bit because they're in the background or middle ground. But the other important thing is that you want to bring out the moving notes and back off during the longer sustains. There are some exceptions, obviously. You might have a long note that's supposed to crescendo into the next note, or you might have some moving lines like ostinato parts that are definitely not supposed to be brought out as much. But the general rule is bring out the moving parts and back off on the sustaining notes. This is something that performers in an ensemble are taught to do. I remember playing in large ensembles and being told this repeatedly by the conductor. And it's especially true for this type of contrapuntal writing, where even though the cello part has the melody, there are moments where the other parts have a middle ground moving line that really should come out. And that usually happens when the cello is sustaining a long note. So that's where you maybe back off a little bit on the cello. So at some point I go back to the start and add in some CC11 data, usually just to complement what I did in CC1. I pay attention to the attacks of notes. Sometimes I need to soften the attack if it sounds too harsh. Occasionally I'll see people mocking up strings and they use such extreme dynamic and expression curves. Maybe that works for certain pieces of music or styles, but I don't think it works for this kind of music. Okay, so once I feel like I have this Berlin cello track about 90% of the way there, I'm going to copy this track into the Spitfire Appassionata track. I've actually found that I don't need to do too much work here to get this sounding good. The way these instruments behave, the Berlin and the Spitfire, and the way they use controller data is pretty similar, I found. But occasionally I need to change note placement or duration. I think Spitfire Appassionata strings has a really sudden release of the note, even after I've gone into the interface and increased the release time. So sometimes I have to extend notes or just treat the fading out differently. Okay, so I go through the entire cello part. Now let's hear how these layered cello tracks sound together. All right, so now I do the same exact thing with the viola part. I'll copy that MIDI track into the Berlin viola legatos track and start by getting the right bowings and note placement. Then I worry about getting that dynamics. Violas are not the foreground instrument here, but like I said, there are times when that line needs to come out a bit. Basically, anytime they have eighth notes. That seems to be when I want to let that line be a little bit stronger. Otherwise, I want to make sure to back off and let the cello melody be heard. Then I copy that MIDI data into the Spitfire track and spend some time editing that to fit the instrument. Then I'll listen to both viola tracks together and decide if I need to make any adjustments. But in this case, it's a little difficult to know how to adjust the viola dynamics until you listen to them playing with the cellos. Keep in mind that the viola section should be quieter than the cello section. Not only are violas naturally softer in this range than cellos, the viola part is in the background, so like I said, we're not looking for perfect volume balance. The cellos should be a little stronger. I'm going to repeat that same process for both violin sections. In this particular bit of music, the first violins take over the melody about halfway through, so I make sure that that part comes through the texture easily, and I back off on the cellos and the rest of the strings. Here's what I have so far with violins 1, 2, violas, and celli. In terms of basses, I tend not to layer them with two sample libraries. I think it gets a little too muddy down there, so I'm just using the Berlin basses here. I go pretty light on bass dynamics overall. Here's what it sounds like when basses enter. And here's another really important step. I've discussed this in previous videos. You need to edit the tempo track to mimic what a conductor would do. Most of the time, I don't want a static tempo. It should fluctuate up and down, maybe plus or minus 5 to 10 BPM. And then at the ends of phrases, it's common to have the tempo really slow down. If possible, you should import a real orchestral recording of the piece you're mocking up, then try your best to copy that recording's tempo by drawing in the changes in the tempo map. That's what I did for this one. It's a bit tedious, but it's really worth it. I'll play the whole string section now with these tempo fluctuations. All right, to finish this section, I've added in the flute parts and the harp part. Putting that all together, here's what I end up with. I haven't mixed this at all, just volume balance in the MIDI data. And I have a bunch of plugins already in place in my template, but after this, I would want to figure out the mix specific to this music. I won't bother with that in this video though. All right, so that's my basic process for getting a string mock-up together relatively quickly. You don't need to be able to play piano, and you could really use any notation software or DAW. They all pretty much work the same. Anyways, hope this was helpful, and see you next time.